The Two Dragons. Merlin, the wise man that ever served King Uther through his magic art. Merlin, the most famous magician of legend, even in his youth seemed to be unlike the ordinary boy, and a good many people said that he was half fairy, and were rather afraid of him. He never did wicked or cruel things, but he would often rock his sides with laughter, for what seemed to be no reason at all. Sometimes he would disappear for a week or two, and it was whispered of him that he would catch and ride the wild stags, and that when he rode a great antlered beauty, all the pretty does and their young followed him, so that the forest glades seemed alive with flying herds of deer. The gossips said, too, that the fairy people were building a house for Merlin in the deep green places of the woods, a house with 70 windows and 60 doors, where, as soon as he was old enough, he would live quite alone. But when Merlin was stared at on account of these things, he only laughed to himself, as usual, and unconcerned went about his business. Then, one day, a party of horsemen came riding along towards the palace in which Merlin had been born. They asked all whom they met where they could find a certain handsome youth, of whom many strange tales were told. The things they mentioned were exactly the stories that were told about Merlin, so, of course, everybody who answered the horsemen told them where Merlin could be found. And curiously enough, as the riders drew rein before the gate of the city, there stood the slender boy with his laughing mouth and eyes so clear and wild and free. One of the horsemen sprang down, seized Merlin, and flung him on his own saddle. Then he sprang up behind, set spurs to his steed, and galloped off in company with his friends. Merlin neither struggled nor cried out. He just laughed to himself as usual, for ever since he was a baby he had known that this would happen to him. On went the party of horsemen at full speed, until they came to a country far from Merlin's home. Between the mountain passes they rode, and presently came out upon a low plain where hundreds of workmen were toiling and toiling and toiling to build a great tower. They had brought great piles of stones together, but these were lying about, broken or piled in muddled heaps. Men on horseback rode to and fro, calling out directions or rebuking the workmen for their carelessness. The poor workmen staggered about, placing the stones one on top of the other. But however careful they were, or in whatever position they put them, the stones were no sooner set up than they, one and all, fell down again. Watching the work from a grassy mound stood a tall man in armor, with a crown on his head and a cruel yet frightened face under the crown. Behind him waited a standard-bearer in royal purple, royal purple, and over his crowned head hung the flag that had floated over many a prince of a long line of kings. The company of horsemen galloped up to the mound. Taking Merlin down from the horse, they led him bound up to the cruel-eyed monarch who stood there. "Is this the boy?" asked the king. "You have found the child who was described to me?" "Yes, sire," answered the rider who had first seized Merlin. "We have found him and brought him to you." The king looked steadily and fiercely at Merlin, who smiled back pleasantly, not at all afraid. "You laugh, child," said the king, with a heavy frown. "You do not know your fate. Do you see those stones in that place where men have built the foundations of a great tower?" Merlin nodded. He looked around at the heaps of unused stones, so many of which were broken and spoiled. "In that tower," went on the king, "I mean to find a safe refuge from the terrible enemies who swarm on all sides of my country. These foes will, assuredly, ride one day over the mountains, and, unless I provide a safe retreat, will conquer my kingdom and kill me. Only a strong tower can be my haven. But, although I have tried for many months to build it, no sooner are the stones set up than they all fall down again." "I'm not at all surprised to hear it," said Merlin, apparently little interested in what the king was saying. "Wait," growled the king, like angry thunder. "You will soon be less unconcerned. I was told by a magician that only the blood of a youth of whom it was said he was half a fairy could give firmness to the foundations of the tower. You, I understand, are that unhappy child. My tower I must have, though your blood be spilled in order to build it." Even this cruel king looked unhappy as well as alarmed as he spoke. But in spite of all his sorrow and his fear, he was quite determined to kill Merlin so that he could go on building his tower. Merlin laughed, bowed, and sat down on the grass of the mound right under the royal purple flag that was held by the royal standard bearer. "Indeed," he said, "but even my blood, great king, will not help you to build a tower on top of a lake of water." The king frowned with perplexity and stared at the boy who was said to be half a fairy. "Lake of water? What do you mean?" he demanded. "There is no lake here, nothing but solid, red-brown earth. Set your workmen to dig around the foundations of your unfinished, tumbling-down tower, and you will soon see for yourself," laughed Merlin, rocking himself to and fro with his hands clasped about his knees. The king, whose name was Vortigern, was so amazed that he actually did as the strange mocking boy told him. He sent for the architect, who was trying in vain to build the tower, and bade him order the workmen to dig around about the foundations with their spades. So the workmen stopped trying to set up the stones and began shoveling out the soil instead. And behold, almost immediately they were digging in the mud, and up bubbled the hidden water through the mud, and down fell the banks of the ditches, followed by all the stones that had not tumbled down before. And as the stones and banks slipped down, more and more water rushed up, until at last the whole of the middle of the plain was one great lake from which the workmen were all running away in one direction, and the architect and the horsemen in another. But King Vortigern and Merlin still sat together under the royal standard on the grassy summit of the mound, gazing earnestly at the enormous lake. Then the king turned to Merlin, more afraid now of this strange laughing boy than of all the people who he expected to come riding over the hills to kill him and seize his kingdom. "What does it all mean?" he asked, trembling. "What does it all mean?" Merlin shook his head. Suddenly tears sprang to his eyes and rolled down his cheeks. He was sorry for the cruel king, though Vortigern had never been sorry for him. "There is a great stone below the lake," he said in a whisper. "Two dragons sleep there, one red and one white. One day they will come out from under the stone and meet on the waters of the lake in a fearful battle. In the white dragon is the soul of your strongest enemy. In the red dragon you may see the reflection of yourself." Then Merlin stepped down from the mound and went slowly away, and nobody tried to hold him. But Vortigern sat on the grass and stared for a week on end at the still green waters of the magical lake. And at last, while he stared, he saw the waters shudder and break into great waves. The waves sprang higher and higher and broke into foamy strands, looking like the white and shaggy manes of horses tossed by the wind. Then up through the hills and valleys of the storm-lashed water came the white dragon and the red dragon. The white dragon was as pale as snow, and the red dragon was as scarlet as blood. There, with a great cry, the red dragon fell dead upon the beach. There it is. See it again? Dragon. Okay. Their wings, high above the angry waves, looked like crimson and silver clouds flying low across the sky, and from end to end of the fairy lake they fought each other, until, with a great cry, the red dragon fell dead upon the beach among the green rushes and the broken stems of the water flowers. Vortigern rose and fled, but he thought he heard the voice of the fairy boy echoing all around about him as he went. "In the white dragon is the soul of your strongest enemy. In the red dragon you may see the reflection of yourself." The king arrived at his palace, quaking with fear, but lo! His courtiers came running to tell him that the lake had sunk back deep into the earth, and that now the workmen were building his tower as fast as ever they could. So Vortigern began his old, cruel, wicked ways once more. Then, as soon as the tower was finished, he shut himself up in it for safety. But at night, very often, he woke up panting with terror, for, in his dreams, he had seen again the mighty dragon battle between the white dragon and the red dragon. And as he had feared, one day his strongest enemy came over the hills with a great army, for Vortigern's people, racked with their king's wickedness and cruelty, had sent out a pitiful cry for help. The king who rode over the hills was great and good, and he rescued the unhappy people, and then went to the big tower and bade Vortigern come out. There was no answer from inside, and so the soldiers set fire to the tower, and it blazed fiercely for days and days, until at last the walls were all burned away. Nothing was left but a heap of ruins lying on the very spot where the red dragon had fallen dead after the great fight with the white dragon on the lake. Vortigern had been shut up in the tower all this time, so that it happened that he was killed by the great king just as the red dragon had been killed by the white. But nobody could be sorry, for he had been cruel to everyone, and would have willingly slayed Merlin to save his own wicked life. So the good king reigned over the kingdom in his place, and was called Uther Pendragon. The reasons for this name and some of the things that Uther did you will read about in another story. Chapter 2. The Holy Grail.